Welcome once again, viewer. Last chapter, Eidolon the Illuminator had begun his crusade to the Trappist system in a hope to prevent Tiberius from ever regaining his former glory. Now, we return to the worlds of Trappist 1, as the Geragyn Lords initiate their operation to hunt down Tiberius. Chapter 5, A Blitz in the Trees. Nearby, the Oberó village at its outskirts, though still within visual range to make out the Geragyn Lords and burning tree houses, the cylindrical spacecraft Marloch piloted had made planetfall. While steam radiated off the hull from re-entry, he had already sprung out from the hatch and began a sprint towards the village, sliding under falling trees and swinging from branches over crevices of streams. The suit he wore gave him a vast improvement on mobility, endurance, and power. Assisted by an AI, he could maneuver through the thick foliage like it was an ordinary training session at an obstacle course for toddlers. The distance he was making steadily put him closer and closer to the village. He was outfitted with his standard rifle, knife, and pistol in case anything tried to confront him. After all, a correspondent may be antagonized and threatened. Something about messengers being shot gave an insight to the arming of emissaries and correspondents as a whole. Through his helmet's receptors, he could without any form of doubt be aware of what was occurring through the thick plants, weeds, and trees of the forest, even if the glow of the distant fires pierced through the gaps and the deafening roars and gunfire that the Geragyn brought. Given his experience with Tiberius earlier, Marloch grew a sense of curiosity, a sense of hype to find out just how the three were faring against him. However, his anticipation was put on hold. His motion tracker had picked up a group of 5 individuals ahead. When he was in visual range, it was a group of Oberó, 4 of which trying to lift a fallen tree that had toppled onto the 5th, who was still alive, but both legs were crushed. Unlike the Geragyn Lords, who were engulfed in an urge to kill, Marloch had sworn his duty, and the rules do not change. He stopped at the log. The Oberó were understandably in peril, and withdrew from him while the one under the log shouted slurs towards him. Marloch bent his knees and kept his back straight, executing a deadlift with the assistance of his armor's built-in endoskeleton, cleanly lifted the log. He signalled with a flick of his head to the others to help retrieve the injured man. The 4 picked him up and flew away, carrying directly away from the tremendous choir of cannons and crashings of wood and stone. What sort of nonsense was going on at the town? The question was at the forefront of his mind, aside from the preemptive planning for a potential engagement, though reminding himself that he is an observer first, combatant second. Finally, a commando broke through the tree line to the town. Unsurprisingly, from the sound alone, most of the buildings were ablaze and in a state of crumbling to embers. Orange and red hues dominated every corner, from so much light given off by the fires that the shadows casted were themselves in disarray. A weird scenario was, well, not there. Where were the 3 house-sized giants and Tiberius? The sounds of their confrontation could still be heard loud and clear, but visually, you'd think to see things that large above the lines of the building's rooftops. No matter. Marloch was now forced to engage in a different act, securing civilians if any were around. Civil duties compel him to do so, given the circumstances, and is part of the doctrine of the Ryan Loyalist. The only people that shall be fired upon are combatants. Any that surrender, or are not part of the fighting, are to be treated fairly, securely, and safely detained. He navigated through the open courtyard of a school district, listening out for any calls for help with the assistance of his suit. It could recognize the sound of the inferno around him, and then choose to ignore it. In a way, it would filter out any noises that could overpower any potential voices or calls for help. The technology was useful, after all. it immediately picked up the shouting of a young man inside the library, if the scattered and burned books were anything to go by. With utmost haste the commando barged through the doors that were scorched by the fires inside. Through the smoke he could see the young man, with burn marks on his face and half of his clothing removed to prevent him from joining the others, already engulfed by the fire, charred black and unrecognisable. The boy's fear of the Orions for the moment was understandably overridden by the fires around him. Marloch kicked away the piles of burning bookshelves to clear the way for him to escape. The instant the opportunity came, the boy dashed right through into his arms, being lifted with one and swiftly carried back through the entrance. Outside at the steps of the library, the boy was put down and asked if he could continue his way. He nodded and swiftly made a break to the trees, before being lifted off the ground by a familiar face. It was Phaon, who gave a stern look of disgust towards Marloch before flying away with the boy. Wasting no time, Marloch swiftly made his way through an alleyway that led to the town square. He spotted native wildlife, predators by the looks of them, considering they were eating the bodies of Oberon that were left there on the floor. Pink and purple fur to blend into the foliage and glistening crystalline teeth. They fixated their gaze onto him with amber eyes and snarled. They were huge. They looked at Marloch in the eye. In his armour, he was around 8 feet tall, recalling when Phaon mentioned Tiberius would be hired to keep them at bay. Seeing them for himself, it was understandable. The beast made a charge for him. Before it could clear a quarter of that distance, it was taken down with extreme efficiency. The rifle Marloch held fired a projectile that penetrated its skull and exited through the rear ever so cleanly, and at such speed the creature's body had yet to realise it was dead. That was remarkably easy, he thought to himself. Well, for him at least. He could see why the natives would have a bad time. The nervous system finally realised the reality of the damage it suffered, and the beast swiftly dropped to the floor. The captain's attention was brought back to his original objective, listening and figuring out the direction of all the chaos that the Geragyn Lords were casting upon their target. Marloch wanted to make sure he had the best vantage point. What more obvious place than the top floor of the town hall? Despite its current condition, he could still see the top, and by its height his suit would be able to cushion a landing should a need to take a plunge from the top balconies arose. He swiftly broke through the doorways, leaping onto the stairs that lined the walls to the top, and jumped the gaps where the wood had given up holding against the flames. His armour's shielding kept them at bay, clambering up through the floors. On his way up, it was no secret to him that some of the crunching noises beneath his feet were the charred remains and bones of those unfortunate enough to not escape in time. Shoulder barging through bookcases, sliding under fallen beams, and scaling cracks on the walls to reach to the top, Marloch faltered. The hall was struck from the outside by the collision of one of the Geragyn Lords crashing against it. The tree swayed side to side like a severe gale was testing its roots. Luckily, they held long enough to stabilise, but the captain now knew he was on borrowed time inside this structure. Finally, he had reached the top floor, and the observation balcony that overlooked the plains and town. As he was about to look to where the fight was going on, the tree was struck again, more severely than the last, by both the frantic shaking and loud roar of pain from down below. Furniture began to tumble and slide while Marloch gained his balance and clung to the floor by punching a hole through it, holding his arm into the cavity. The tree swayed back to normal, but the inertia carried it to tilt the opposite way. Furniture slid back toward the original side they were on. Some even crashed and broke against Marloch's armour. The tree eventually stabilised, but below 2 floors caved in, jolting everything into the air and slamming against the floor. A wardrobe shattered near Marloch, and 2 Oberon rolled from the splintered wood. They were still alive, a father and his son. Duty-bound, Marloch rushed over to give aid. Examining them both, the father was choking from exposure to smoke and burns on his skin. The boy was for better mostly intact, the father did his best to shield him, but he was now in the most peril. Marloch's objective, overridden once again, looks to the balcony and guesses the distance to the ground to be far closer to what it was before the floors below had collapsed. Time was not on his side, as the wood beneath him began to turn black. The flames below had caught up to the top floor and were blazing through parts of the staircase standing twice as tall as he was. Smoke began to bellow too. Knowing the father was already on the verge from choking out, Marloch removed his helmet to put it onto the man, so it would provide some clean air while he got them out. The father protested at first, trying to get it onto his son, but Marloch knew there was no time for arguing. He placed the helmet on the man and yelled for the boy to hold his breath. All three took a deep breath and held it as hard as they could, knowing if they let go now, it would have been their last. The captain picked them both up and held them close to his chest. The flames burst from the floor behind him, and the tree began to fall opposite to the direction he was running. His speed brought him plummeting out of the balcony, and with enough momentum cleared the flames below. Fortunately for him, there was a building nearby, and he had landed with enough force to crack and bend the wood beneath his feet, but not enough to cave in through the roof. Quickly checking the condition of the two he carried, finding to have no damage from the fall, they observed the fallen town hall burst into flames as it meets the embers below. No warning from the howling of wind was enough to alert Marloch of the mass heading his way. It collided with him, knocking both Oberon from his arms. The father and boy rolled towards the edge. The man stopped himself and grabbed his son before he rolled off and held him to his chest. Looking at the direction where the object was thrown, Marloch was left paralysed from fear. The Geragyn Lords were staring at his direction with malice in their eyes. To his left, the roof tiles began to slide down, and the mass that landed there was their target, Tiberius. Marloch couldn't decide who to be more concerned between the two, and defaulted to the father and son below. He rushed towards them with the intent to get them as far away as possible. Though as he grabbed the father to help him up, on the corner of his eye, a sight that someone of the Orion military should never want to see, the barrel of the Geragyn Lord's arm-mounted cannons aimed towards him, and the whirring energy sourced from its capacitors showing its preparation to fire. It was Balthasaur taking aim. Despite Marloch being in the radius, more importantly civilians, it appeared that the collateral damage would be worthwhile to take a shot at Tiberius stood next to them. Marloch desperately dashed with the two to try get out of the way, but the loud crackling of plasma soaring towards them like a comet signalled their imminent demise. He could see the dire expression on both of their faces, that despite his efforts to save them, it was about to be for naught. Though Marloch felt a force push him off his feet and onto the ground below. Then he heard the crash of the plasma, followed by its explosion. He was on the ground, off the roof, but safe. But he didn't have that much power even from his suit to propel him that fast, followed by the bizarre smooth landing. The answer became clear to his right. Cradling the two men on his chest, with his back denting from the ground beneath, was Tiberius. He turned into a blur while carrying the pair as a second shot was fired towards him. The blast knocked Marloch off his feet and his shields gave up. They would need about 10 seconds to fully recharge. He got back up to his feet and watched as the Geragyn Lords charged in his direction. Like the average person would ignore the insects at their feet, so too did these three beasts, forcing Marloch to dive out of their way, then crashing through to another building. Across the road, the man and his son were safe, Tiberius nowhere in sight. Sounds of cannons firing and the roars of Balthasaur were answered that question swiftly. A winged individual descended from the cover on some of the trees still standing. He had used the large leaves to conceal himself from the sights of these lords. His distinct fur pattern was familiar to Marloch. It was Phaon once again, who shared a glance of shame of the captain before helping the two fly off towards the planes. High above in orbit, on the Pyrrhic negotiation, one room amongst the 10,000s was working at a higher pace than half of the rest combined. The mission control deck. Nearby and accessible from the bridge, the staff inside are primarily Taesh, working on the honeycomb of monitors aligning the walls, and one from the ceiling. Among the numbers of the essential personnel were Decimus, Kalur, Jarl, Ensign Dagmafor, and Biako. The latters were working at different terminals with the exception of Kalur and Biako, who stood at the edge of the oval command table, displaying a holographic projection of the town below. Among the structures were 5 lights. 3 large red represented the Geragyn Lords, the lesser was Marloch, and the blue was Tiberius, though it occasionally blinked out of the scanner when it lost track of its movements. In this moment, however, the 3 were all looking at the video feed being displayed above it, all with duplicates facing opposite directions to each other, so that the rest of the attending staff could get an uncompromised view. At first, when the operation began earlier, the surveyors were indifferent to the situation. However, when Balthasaur initiated combat, the mood had turned to a more sour feeling. When the video feed of Marloch had shown exactly what transpired, that he was fired upon by those who are meant to be on his side, and the consideration of civilians completely thrown away by the Geragyn, the mood had evolved into outrage. Denejar officials who were present argued with other members of the room over the event. Shouting, pointing, and cussing had tested Decimus's patience. He slammed his fist to the desk, and his security dragging out one of the troublemakers, with Kalur dragging 2 herself out of the room, where other security awaited to detain and confine them to the brig. Letting herself back in, and the door locking behind her, the room's light dimmed to just the centerpiece. All present were silenced by the commander's order. His deep, guttural voice was enough to raise the hairs of those hearing it. They wouldn't try their commander's patience any more. Decimus stared blankly into the display, holding his chin, contemplating the next course of action. The Orion doctrine, while imperial, still held the treatment of non-combatants to be with dignity. And here were the most powerful assets of the ship throwing around their weight like a pouty child thrashing a sandcastle. Kalur spoke her piece to him. With a clenched fist gestured to the screen. They should be punished in accordance with the law. Their disregard should not go unpunished. Biako agreed, but had warned caution on the handling of the situation, especially on the Geragyn Lords themselves. Confining these 3 were going to be difficult, but not impossible, since their quarters also served as a makeshift prison if the need arose, a safety measure. Decimus had made up his mind. Although it was in line with both views, he at least wanted to make sure they were thinking on the same wavelength as him. The support and morale of the crew had to be maintained, and depending on the circumstances, he was going to have some measure of discord. It was damage control. He ordered Jarl and Biako to oversee the security details that would contain the Geragyn Lords should they return, and ordered Kalur to make sure the recordings currently going on will be backed up and secured as evidence for later, at the prosecution. Decimus leaned onto the desk and closely monitored the battle. He thought back to his encounter with Tiberius earlier. He really did hold back. But why would he? That question was currently occupying a lot of space in his mind. He thought back to the conversations he had between the Obero, highlighting that Tiberius was reclusive. He wanted to be left alone. Recent events would give him more of a cause to consider taking the fight to them, should he survive. There was a lot of pathways to choose, and the commander found himself at many junctions. He knew whatever decisions he would make would have knock-on effects. For counsel, he called upon his ambassadors for advice. He was proposing an idea that was received with outlandish refutes. It was to negotiate an armistice with Tiberius, on the probable condition that he remains on the world and they themselves leave him to it. But in secret, they would monitor him to ensure he held up that end of the bargain. Calla was most opposed to the idea. Understandably, letting him get away with killing 2 soldiers belonging to her was something she would not forgive so easily. Biako admired the idea. Diffusing the situation and leaving it as a stalemate would be more admirable than facing him if he did defeat the lords below. Because if they couldn't, then who would be called upon in a hurry? A bleeping sound from the door alerted the 3. The security feed showed it to be Jarl, waiting outside. Clearance was given, and he entered holding a datapad showing the records of an outgoing message from the ship. Jarl had noted a very distinct one among the rest, specifically highlighting both its sender and recipient. The sender was Balthasaur. The message contained a distress call and a mention of Tiberius and a request for help to prove the power of the faith. This genuinely frustrated the commander, with a vein visibly appearing to pulsate on his head and the stretching of fabric on his clenched fist. That tension was swiftly replaced with concern, major concern, when he looked at the name of the recipient. Eidolon the Illuminator. On the planet below, Marloch had done a more thorough search of the town and found it to be empty, except for the battle going on inside its confines. Crashing through buildings, splintering trees, and igniting the surrounding pastures of crops and flowers, the livestock were lucky enough to make a break for it once their enclosures' entrances were blasted apart or smashed open, rejoining the wilds. The captain understood he had to make sure he was within visual of the battle, though made extreme precautions to avoid the crossfire and himself becoming a collateral loss. Gaining a vantage point on top of the embered remains of the town hall, he recorded. He noticed the way Tiberius was fighting them with much more ferocity than before. Perhaps he knew himself the town was deserted and could increase his offence. But that would lay a thought that took a hold on Marloch. Given the recent protection of civilians his foe had performed had him wondering if he wasn't the monster of the history books told, or at the least held some form of rules of engagement that focused on the combatants exclusively. However, those thoughts were placed in the back of his mind, as the raw power on display intrigued him. Could you really blame him for being taken back by the spectacle of the 3 giants seemingly fighting at full strength against a single man? It's a little insane, for sure. Targos took the lead with the other 2 tailing behind, swinging downwards with his axe, dodged by Tiberius. Before he was struck in retaliation, Kilmareth barged Tiberius into the air, like a buffalo striking a lion with its horns. Balthasaur, with the help of his wings, leapt over them both, firing his plasma cannon without a sense of preserving the integrity of his allies, forcing the 2 to dash backwards. Spotting the lost ground and subsequent confusion and anger by both lords, Tiberius sprinted at a speed that made him appear as a blur underneath Balthasaur's legs and lunged towards Kilmareth's head. He grabbed onto both of his horns. Tiberius held on as the Geragyn Lord tried to shake him off, even slamming a couple of trees to try. With rage on his face, baring his teeth, Tiberius struck the nose, one bone-crunching blow after the other, until it caved in entirely. Reeling, Kilmareth's head backwards in pain and tripping over a falling tree, crashing into a building, its smouldering remains scorching the beast, forcing him to jolt to his feet and flail his wings around in a rapid motion, enough to cut off the air supply for the flames, though the steam and smoke had yet to dissipate from him. In the cloud of smoke, Tiberius made another move, grabbing the Lord's tail, and planked at his feet before slowly, but ever increasing in speed, began to throw Kilmareth around, like you would an Olympic hammer. Targos tried to interrupt him, but was struck by Kilmareth, knocking him into the air to get caught and dropped aside by Balthasaur. Before he could take his turn to attack, Balthasaur wasn't fortunate enough for his other ally, who crashed into him, dragging them both to the floor and sliding 40 metres before coming to a halt in a large pile of compost and steaming manure. And to the horror of Kilmareth, his tail was with Tiberius, completely amputated from the centrifugal force causing its flesh to rip off. Marloch was quite frankly frustrated to the strength on display here, knowing that his first encounter with Tiberius he was being toyed with, not worth his full strength. Paying closer attention, he had some assurance, noting some bruises on Tiberius, as well as scorch marks, and the panting. Using everything he could, Tiberius lifted the tail and crudely wielded it with both arms, like a club. When Balthasaur charged, he was forced to dodge backwards to avoid a direct hit from a plasma cannon, though not far enough to feel the burn that singed his left hand. The rest was covered by the tail. The beast was almost stepping on him when it drove down its axe. This time he dashed to the side, twirling around to gain momentum before he landed on the floor. When he did, he pivoted his body around while putting all his strength into swinging the tail like a whip. Its spiked tip struck Balthasaur in the face, shattering half of his sword-like teeth, falling like hailstones to the ground. While the enraged beast gained its composure, Tiberius clambered onto his belt and tore the buckle off, revealing a mere loincloth, hiding the Geragyn Lord's genitals underneath. Taken back and surprised, Balthasaur tried to cover up and yelled insults. In this instance of rage, Tiberius capitalized and grabbed a boulder as big as himself and hurled it towards his balls. They struck, and the beast got down to the floor, screeching in agony, even rolling onto his back and into a fetal position. With one of the lords temporarily out of the battle, the focus shifts onto the other two. Targos ripped one of the cannons Balthasaur held and planted it onto the rail system located on his right hand, since the left had a plasma turret on already. He fired a flurry of plasma to his target. Tiberius used the cover of some of the collapsed buildings to hide and strafe through. Then Targos fired his cannon at a house that he knew Tiberius was not in, but would be. As predicted, he had lured him into a trap, and the volley was a red herring that Tiberius took, and the cannon's plasma crashed into the building he dashed towards, visibly showing his target rolling on the floor and at a rapid pace, even crashing through a couple of walls before coming to a halt. He seized the opportunity, Kilmareth, and stomped on Tiberius with his foot, while Targos attended to Balthasaur, getting him to his feet and attaching his belt and folds before patronizing him for his carelessness. An argument broke out between the two, though was diffused when they immediately heard Kilmareth howling in exertion. It was unbelievable. Tiberius was resisting the weight of the Geragyn Lord trying to stomp on him. He could hear a muffled roar from Tiberius before his foot was raised slightly into the air, though just enough for Tiberius to roll out from underneath. Targos wasn't wasting time. He sprinted towards him and kicked him into the air before he had the chance to stand, hurtling above the canopy of the trees and landing 80 metres away in the outskirts that still had flaming trees. Kilmareth followed his leader into the trees, eventually being concealed by the leaves, smoke and flames that enveloped the surrounding area. Marloch made his way behind them, but took a glance at Balthasaur to see if he was combat ready. At first glance, for a man whose genitals had been struck with a high-speed rock, he was doing remarkable. Marloch had winced when he saw it happen, a universal understanding. He tilted his head a little, focusing on his posture and the large book he had just opened from his belt. His camera had zoomed in, and he could read the words, "The Truth of Faith." On the other end of Marloch's transmission were Decimus and the others were watching. They listened in on these words being uttered by Balthasaur.
The Emperor's might and wisdom holds no equal, and all of us mere dust particles in the wind of his breath. Though so high above, he inspires us to reach as close as we can, be to his embrace. Emperor, guide me. The great enemy stands strong against our tide, but we will envelop him. May the faith guide us and hold us in its power.
He kneels, placing his forehead to the ground and settling his wings to the air. Marloch made to the direction of the others, but his footsteps caught the attention of Balthasaur, who stands to his full height and opens his wings wide. Marloch was tense for a reason he couldn't understand. Like the weight of a divine presence trembled his very bones. The disturbing part was the smile that Balthasaur had broke. It was a joyous and full of reverence to the Emperor. It was happy. Balthasaur bowed his head and his hands in prayer to Marloch before speaking the phrase,
Emperor guides all of his subjects, even those that do not believe his divinity,
before embarking into the tree line in a stride reminiscent of a victorious conqueror, with Marloch in a full sprint just trying to keep up. In a hot pursuit of Balthasaur, the other two lords came into view. Tiberius was using the trees to rapidly dash and vanish from the sight of the Geragyn, occasionally hitting them in the shins, knees, and other joints to progressively cripple them. Tiberius had experience with fighting these beings back in the Geragyn Wars, though with greater ease. If he had his armaments and former power, they would already have been mutilated and he would have been starting on another group. But his experience gave him different ways to attack, even without his typical loadouts. He would strike at critical points and chip away at them like a mosquito, albeit a very powerful one at that. He wasn't going for a quick victory. It wouldn't end well if trading blows with them at his current state. Already bruised, scraped, and burned in places. Balthasaur yelled to the others to get out of the way. Knowing already his disregard for their safety, they obliged by rolling to the sides. The faithful lord leapt into the air with his arms raised and hands clasped together, roaring as he plummeted. Ribbons of glowing yellow light swirled around his arms and crashed into the ground along with his fist. The ribbons turned into a shock wave of light and archaic letters and runes. Anything it touched became scorched and bleached completely white, sterilized of all bacteria and life. The lords looked around for any signs of Tiberius. The silence following the impact was giving them anxiety. They needed to know if that worked. Balthasaur, with his arms wide open in victory and admiration of his emperor, boasted of putting down the great enemy with just one attack, entranced in monologue and prayer. Underneath Kilmareth, the ground itself was also bleached a chalk white. The grass had disintegrated and the soil cleansed, but a distinct patch had a bump behind his foot that wasn't, since he stood in the way of the light. The dirt began to stir slowly as the figure of Tiberius arose, still not discovered by the lords, but Marloch instead, who shouted to Kilmareth to look behind him, but the preaching Balthasaur blocked out his voice. Marloch could only watch as he saw Tiberius leap onto the back of Kilmareth, grabbing the base of his wings and holding onto them like a cowboy at a rodeo. Kilmareth thrashed around trying to get him off. Marloch focused onto the eyes of Tiberius that glowed like blue lanterns as he began to pull on these wings. Zooming in for a better look, he could see veins appearing on his feathered muscles and the snarling face of Tiberius. Using all his might, the struggling hoofs of Kilmareth turned into groans and then cries of pain. Targos tackled Kilmareth to the floor, making sure he landed on his back to crush Tiberius under the weight of them both, and yelled at Balthasaur to snap out of it. The two got up as the pain stopped. He came from the ground and saw no sight of Tiberius in the dirt. Then the pain returned. Tiberius was still grabbed onto his armour so he wouldn't feel on the bare part of the wings. This time for Kilmareth, he had no time to react. Through the shriek he let out, the crackling fires and heavy winds that propelled them like a tsunami, the sound of crunching and breaking bones accompanied by the tearing muscles and sinew of Kilmareth's were ever so prominent. As the blood sprayed from them, they were torn completely off. If this were another creature with wings, this would have been it. Game over, curtains closed, but not for the Geragyn. In an instant the shriek stopped. Tiberius landed using the winds as a makeshift glider before tossing them aside. Targos, shocked and enraged, charged towards Tiberius, but his leg was swept, not by Tiberius, but Kilmareth, consumed with rage and motivated by the pain, had dropped to all fours and rampaged towards Tiberius like a lion, snarling with a bloodied mouth, occasionally spewing fire with each breath he exhaled. Leaping towards Tiberius, forcing him to dodge, Kilmareth blew fire and flung his weight around. A violent, murderous tantrum was enough to put Tiberius into a corner. He was not expecting this whatsoever. Targos tried his best to keep up with his comrade, trying to fire and hit Tiberius with his cannons, though he wasn't risking friendly fire and so was at a constant loss to try and get a hit. Balthasaur finally snapped out of his trance and immediately turned to despair with the grim reality that not only didn't he kill Tiberius, but his mumbling and early celebration has put his compatriots in peril. Tiberius became aware of this due to the lack of self-righteous rambling had ceased, and made a break towards Balthasaur with Kilmareth in tail. Balthasaur charged another arc of energy onto his arms, with the same scrolls as before. Before he could bring them down onto Tiberius, he was jumped towards by his adversary, who landed on his chest and hastily bounced off it. The confusion had brought enough time for Balthasaur to ignore Kilmareth that was lunging towards him. They collided and Balthasaur struck the back of his head and neck into a tree and then a boulder, followed by a distinct crack coming from his ribcage and spine. Balthasaur was numb. He could barely move or carry his weight and struggled to get himself up off the ground. Marloch had decided to come closer and radio to the flagship of his condition. Decimus replied that he was sending a detachment down. The situation had taken a turn for the worse. Close by, Targos had managed to fire a few shots. One managed to launch Tiberius off his feet and through a tree, breaking off its branches. Tiberius had landed in the wood and began to rise. Targos took another shot. It hit. But it hit Kilmareth, who in his bloodlust tried to bite down and eat Tiberius. The plasma cannon's bolt struck true, breaking bits off his armour and rolling him away, cauterizing his wounds from the extreme heat and leaving a crater at ground zero. Fortunately for Tiberius, being stuck in Kilmareth's mouth saved him from the blast, but now was struggling against the bite force of the Geragyn. Targos saw the struggle and encouraged his comrade to give it all he got, but it was in vain. The cannon that struck him had significantly weakened him. If he was on guard, it wouldn't have caused enough damage, but taken completely off, it shot an arm and the hand of the other. Looking down the throat of Kilmareth, Tiberius had an idea. "If you want to eat me so bad, then here!" he yelled, throwing himself down the throat. Because of his reflexes not acting accordingly, the windpipe of Kilmareth didn't isolate and open the next valve where food was meant to go down, so he began to choke on the blockage. Tiberius dug his arms into the tissue that gushed blood, causing it to bubble from the heat from Kilmareth's past breaths of fire. He would try to, but a lack of air and blood flooding his throat couldn't initiate a combustion. Targos could only watch in horror as Kilmareth's throat began to inflate and bulge in every direction, caused by Tiberius punching from the inside. The scales of Kilmareth began to become discoloured from the lack of air. He dropped to his knees and clasped his throat, trying to vomit him out. Blood gushed from a tear where Kilmareth's voice box would be. Hands reached out from inside and grabbed the torn tissue, spreading the cavity ever wider in a rapid spread of Tiberius's arms, who bursts from the cavity, showered in blood and saliva. Kilmareth's body went completely limp and lifeless, dropping to the floor in an earth-shattering thud. Tiberius merely stared at Targos, goading him to attack, teeth bared glistening through the shower of blood, coating him with a red tint. His two luminous eyes pierced like stars in the night sky above. Targos aimed his cannon and chain gun to Tiberius, thinking to himself if Kilmareth would forgive him for what he was about to do. He fired a barrage from his weaponry. Tiberius saw the moment the Lord had tensed his arm to fire, that telegraphed his intent, and performed a backflip over the corpse of Kilmareth, who cushioned and shielded him from the flurry. The already mutilated body became torn asunder. From the perspective of Targos, the blast of his cannon and volley from his chain gun sprouted dust, stone, wood, and embers, completely shrouding his target. In the centre of his vision, something flew towards him. He dodged to the right, yet a sharp pain came from his wing, and he couldn't move without causing excruciating levels of pain from his left wing. When he observed it, it was staked to a tree behind him, with the sword Kilmareth wielded. He attempted to pull it out, but the axe of his former comrade wielded struck his open hand, nailing it to the tree as well. A blue glow emitted onto him from his right. Turning to face it, he saw a plasma cannon bolt heading straight towards him. The bolt impacted him when he tried to uproot the tree. The explosion blew off both his arms and one of his legs. The wing impaled to the tree was whipped off too, and his organs began to leak from a cavity in his stomach. The Lord could only struggle as the last ounces of energy left him, bleeding out and his eyes losing their glowing orange tint. Marloch hid behind a fallen tree, covered himself in some of the branches that still contained leaves and got as low as he could while being able to observe the surroundings. He focused in on Balthasaur, expecting Tiberius to deliver the finishing blow, for the Geragyn was paralysed and exposed. A minute had passed. Nothing happened. The wind had slowed down, but the smoke of the burning town and trees still blanketed most of the area. Switching to thermal vision, Marloch saw the silhouette of Tiberius running away from them both, with a distinctive limp on his right leg. He began to give chase, but was beckoned by Balthasaur to come back. He stated that he was not his kill, nor that he would not be able to, pointing up to the sky towards the incoming landing craft. Decimus and Calor dropped from the opening ramp of his personal craft, the Firebird, accompanied by armed soldiers and a hovering tank and transport sporting multiple degrees of weaponry. Two other landing craft hovered over the area to try and search for him, and other scouting parties could be seen with their torches cautiously advancing through the foliage. Calor thanked Marloch for the risk he took with a hug and helped him onto the ship, conversing over the footage he had created. As for Decimus, he stood on top of Balthasaur's chest with anger in his eyes. He chastised the defeated giant about his insubordination of breaking the radio silence to outgoing ships, his conversion to the faith being kept secret, and the killing of civilians, ordering the transport to tow him as a much bigger transport arrived with its bay empty, ready to take the Lord up to the ship. As it took off, Decimus strolled around the area to observe the deceased. This was a loss, and the situation severe. In frustration he punched a tree, splintering its base and causing it to fall. Walking back to the Firebird, he radios to his pilot to take the transport to where the Obero had fled, and orders his men to sheathe their weapons. Marloch was surprised and protested, saying that this would draw Tiberius out. Decimus reassured him. That is exactly what he was counting on. With that, another chapter is ended. Join us for the next one, where we figure out and learn the intent behind Decimus's plan.